The PlayStation 2 is remembered as one of the greatest consoles of all time, but its massive library also includes some of the most controversial games ever released. In this video, we take a closer look at the PS2 titles that shocked critics, outraged parents, or pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in gaming. Whether it was due to violent content, provocative themes, or cultural backlash, these games left a lasting mark on the industry and continue to spark debate to this day. So without further ado, let's get into 10 controversial PlayStation 2 games. God of War. God of War launched on the PlayStation 2 in 2005, and it was immediately praised for its cinematic presentation, fluid combat, and mythological storytelling. But it also became a lightning rod for controversy. The game's intense violence stood out even in an era when mature-rated games were becoming more common. Players controlled Kratos, a Spartan warrior whose brutal methods, including ripping enemies apart, impaling mythical creatures, and performing execution-style finishing moves in vivid, bloody detail. This graphic violence, coupled with the game's frequent use of gore as a reward mechanic, alarmed parents, advocacy groups, and some critics who argue that it glorified sadism. Unlike many action games at the time, God of War didn't shy away from depicting violence up close, using cinematic camera angles and slow-motion sequences to emphasize every brutal blow. The concern wasn't just about the level of violence, it was about how stylish and celebratory the violence was portrayed, potentially desensitizing players and influencing younger audiences who found ways to bypass the game's mature ESRB rating. Beyond its violent content, God of War also stirred controversy for its depiction of sexuality and its portrayal of women. The game featured a now infamous QuickTime event sex minigame in which Kratos beds two topless women off-screen, while the player rapidly presses buttons to maintain the encounter. Though the characters were only partially visible, the act was unambiguous, and many critics questioned its necessity and tone, labeling it juvenile and exploitative. Female characters in the game were often presented as objects, either helpless victims, sexualized distractions, or expendable plot devices. Some feminist commentators and media watchdogs pointed out that the game reinforced outdated gender stereotypes and used women primarily for visual appeal or shock value. This sparked broader conversations about how women were portrayed in video games and whether developers were leaning too heavily on sex and violence as marketing tools. While God of War undeniably pushed technical and narrative boundaries, it also ignited debates that highlighted the industry's growing pains as it matured into more adult themes. Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose released for the PlayStation 2 in 2006 and quickly became one of the most controversial games for its generation, despite a limited release and relatively low sales. Set in 1930s England, the game follows a young woman named Jennifer as she navigates a twisted orphanage ruled by a group of sadistic children. The unsettling tone, combined with disturbing imagery and themes of psychological trauma, abuse, and control, immediately raised red flags among critics and parents groups. What truly ignited outrage, however, were the rumors, largely unfounded, that the game contained scenes of explicit child abuse, sexual violence, and pedophilia. These claims, often exaggerated or misrepresented by European media outlets, caused a moral panic in several countries. In Italy, for example, politicians called for the game to be banned outright, and in the United Kingdom, government officials condemned it publicly without full understanding of its content. While the game did include dark and uncomfortable themes involving children, much of the controversy stemmed from the misinformation amplified by sensationalist reporting. The backlash against Rule of Rose had tangible consequences. The game was banned or pulled from distribution in several European countries, and Sony opted not to publish it in North America. leaving the task to Atlas, who gave it only a limited release. Ironically, the controversy may have helped the game achieve cult status, as the scarcity and mystery surrounding it fueled interest among horror fans and collectors. Still, the situation sparked a broader conversation about censorship, artistic expression, and the responsibilities of game developers and publishers when dealing with sensitive subject matter. Many defenders of the game pointed out that Rule of Rose was more psychological than graphic, with much of its disturbing nature rooted in implication and atmosphere rather than explicit content. Nonetheless, the damage was done. The controversy surrounding Rule of Rose highlighted how easy public perception could be swayed by incomplete information, and how video games were still struggling for legitimacy as a storytelling medium capable of tackling dark and mature themes without being vilified.
Listen well, will you marry me? You know well in the suffering.
The Suffering. The Suffering released in 2004 for the PlayStation 2 and pushed the boundaries of what horror games could depict, both in terms of graphic violence and disturbing psychological content. Players assumed the role of Torque, a death row inmate sentenced for the alleged murder of his family, who finds himself battling grotesque manifestations of execution methods come to life. The game was controversial for its unapologetically brutal visuals. Monsters fashioned after lethal injection tables, electric chairs, and firing squads filled the screen with blood and gore, while flashbacks and hallucinations exposed players to graphic scenes of domestic violence, prison abuse, and mental breakdowns. What set The Suffering apart and added fuel to the controversy was its use of real-world issues, like capital punishment, systemic prison violence, and mental illness, all of which were explored through a gritty, mature lens. Critics and parents groups voiced concern over the way the game presented these themes alongside gory, over-the-top action, arguing that it blurred the line between meaningful commentary and shock exploitation. Adding to the controversy was the game's morality system, which allowed players to influence Torque's ultimate fate through their in-game decisions. While this feature was innovative, it also brought criticism as it forced players to make ethically charged choices in a setting many viewed as inappropriate for moral introspection. The game didn't shy away from depicting acts of cruelty or forcing players to confront morally gray situations, such as deciding whether to help fellow inmates or murdering them for personal gain. Some critics argued that the mechanics trivialized serious issues like guilt, redemption, and mental illness by tying them to gameplay outcomes. Others defended the game as a bold narrative experiment in a medium that was still learning how to handle complex storytelling. Nevertheless, The Suffering became a lightning rod in discussions about video game censorship and maturity. Its unapologetic portrayal of violence and trauma, set against the backdrop of a corporate prison system, cemented its reputation as one of the PS2's most controversial titles, provoking both praise for its daring approach and condemnation for its unsettling content. Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2, and it was widely praised for its minimalist design, haunting atmosphere, and emotional, powerful storytelling. However, it sparked considerable debate upon release due to its morally ambiguous narrative and ethical implications of the player's actions. In the game, players control Wanderer, a young man who enters the Forbidden Land and slays 16 massive, majestic colossi in an attempt to resurrect a deceased girl named Mono. What made the game controversial wasn't graphic violence or mature content, it was the emotional manipulation of the player. Each Colossus battle felt less like defeating a villain and more like slaughtering a peaceful, ancient creature that was simply defending itself. Many players reported feeling guilt after each kill as the creature showed no aggression unless provoked. This intentional subversion of traditional hero tropes challenged players to reconsider the nature of violence in games and question whether they were truly the hero of the story. The controversy deepened due to the game's lack of explicit context and its decision to leave major narrative elements open to interpretation. Some critics argued that the game glorified blind devotion and self-sacrifice, presenting a protagonist willing to destroy sacred life for personal desire, no matter the cost. Religious and philosophical undertones throughout the game, including themes of forbidden rituals, resurrection, and the consequence of defying divine law, also drew scrutiny from more conservative circles. These groups felt that the game's storyline, which culminates in Wanderer being overtaken by a demonic entity, could be interpreted as a warning against religious heresy, or conversely, as a sympathetic portrayal of it. This ambiguity sparked debates about the message the game was trying to convey and whether it was appropriate for younger audiences. While Shadow of the Colossus was never banned or censored, its emotional weight and morally complex design helped redefine how video games could provoke introspection and controversy, not through sensationalism, but through artful storytelling and ethical unease. Indigo Prophecy. Indigo Prophecy released on the PlayStation 2 in 2005, and it was immediately praised for its cinematic storytelling and innovative gameplay. But it also sparked significant controversy due to its mature content, narrative themes, and presentation of sexuality. Developed by Quantic Dreams and directed by David Cage, the game blended interactive storytelling with QuickTime event mechanics, placing players in control of multiple characters entangled in a supernatural murder mystery. While critics applauded its ambition and emotional depth, Indigo Prophecy came under fire for pushing the boundaries of acceptable content in a mainstream console game. In particular, a sex scene between two main characters, originally intended to be more explicit, was censored in the North American release to avoid an adults-only rating from the ESRB. However, the uncensored version remained accessible in the European release and throughout modifications on PC, prompting debates over censorship, regional double standards, and whether video games should be treated like films in their exploration of adult relationships and intimacy. The controversy raised broader questions about how far games could go in portraying human emotion, especially when tied to interactivity. Beyond the issue of sexual content, Indigo Prophecy also generated controversy due to its drastic narrative shift in the latter half of the game, which introduced themes involving ancient prophecies, AI overlords, and supernatural entities battling control of the world. What began as a grounded, noir-style thriller exploring morality, guilt, and human psychology evolved, according to many players and critics, into an incoherent science fiction spectacle. This narrative whiplash divided the gaming community, with some defending the game's bold ambition, while others accused it of sacrificing meaningful storytelling for shock value and sensationalism. The game's metaphysical turn also introduced pseudo-religious and psychological elements, including depiction of an omniscient childlike entity and the mythological symbolism, which drew criticism from some religious groups who felt the game was dabbling irresponsibly in spiritual iconography. Additionally, the choice-based gameplay, which was advertised as allowing players to meaningfully influence the story, was criticized for funneling players toward the same predetermined outcomes, undermining the illusion of agency. While Indigo Prophecy helped pave the way for narrative-driven games like Heavy Rain and Detroit Become Human, its controversial handling of adult content, spiritual themes, and storytelling coherence left a complicated legacy that continues to fuel debate in gaming circles. Before we move on with our list, I'd love to know what you think so far. Sound off in the comments below if you're enjoying this video. And while you're down there, be sure to hit the like button. It helps out more than you know. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Okay, back to the list. Killer 7. Killer 7 launched for the PlayStation 2 in 2005. It ignited immediate controversy due to its graphic violence, surreal narrative structure, and unapologetically avant-garde presentation. Killer 7 told the story of an elite assassin team made up of multiple personalities housed within one man, embroiled in a bizarre, hyper-violent conflict with a terrorist group known as Heaven's Smile. What made the game instantly divisive was its unapologetically stylized violence, which included assassinations, exploding enemies, and grotesque death animation, all presented in stark, cel-shaded visuals. Critics and watchdog groups were quick to criticize its mature content, particularly its depictions of torture, suicide, and political assassinations. For many, it wasn't just the violence, it was the surreal tone and frequent blending of sex, death, and politics that made Killer 7 feel disturbing, especially in a medium still striving for mainstream legitimacy. Some retail chains even hesitated to too prominently display the game, and parent groups expressed concern that its ESRB M for mature rating didn't go far enough in flagging its deeply unsettling themes and narrative divisives. Beyond its visceral content, Killer 7 also courted controversy for its narrative structure, which challenged traditional storytelling in video games, to such a degree that many players and critics accused it of being intentionally obtuse or inaccessible. The game's fractured timeline, cryptic dialogue, and heavy use of political allegory, touching on US-Japan relations, global terrorism, and government conspiracies, led to accusations of insensitivity and narrative recklessness. Some political commentators took issue with its dark satire of global diplomacy, suggesting that it trivialized real-world issues through a lens of surreal violence and absurdist philosophy. Meanwhile, others criticized the portrayal of mental illness, particularly in the game's central mechanic of shifting between 7 distinct personalities within a protagonist, as potentially stigmatizing. Additionally, Killer 7's gameplay itself was controversial. Rather than adopting a traditional free movement system, it relied on an on-rails navigation mechanic that baffled many players expecting a standard action game. While these elements earned it a cult status among fans of experimental game design, they also alienated mainstream audiences and reinforced perceptions of the game as deliberately outsider art. As a result, Killer 7 became one of the most polarizing titles of the PlayStation 2 era, celebrated as a work of visionary genius by some, and condemned as pretentious, violent, and incoherent by others. Mafia. Mafia was released on the PlayStation 2 in 2004, but it ignited controversy not only for its mature content, but also for the technical and design compromises that raised questions about the ethics of porting complex titles to less capable hardware. Developed by Illusion Softworks, Mafia stood out for its cinematic storytelling, realistic depiction of organized crime, and period-accurate portrayal of 1930s America. However, the PlayStation 2 version was widely criticized for its drastic downgrades. Textures were heavily compressed, draw distance reduced, and loading times were excessive. What was more controversial, though, was how the game's ambitious open-world mechanics suffered in translation. AI behaviors broke down, physics were inconsistent, and performance issues marred the experience. Many fans and critics accused publisher Gathering of Developers of misleading console players by promising an experience equal to the PC version. This stirred heated debate about consumer trust and whether studios were ethically obligated to ensure ports maintained a certain standard of quality, especially when charging full price. More controversially, Mafia faced backlash for its unflinching portrayal of organized crime, including graphic violence, drug running, extortation, and cold-blooded executions, all presented through a narrative lens that, while critical of the lifestyle, didn't shy away from glorifying its dramatics. The game's protagonist, Tommy Angelo, is a taxi driver turned hitman whose descent into the violent world of the Solari crime family unfolds with emotional nuance, but also with explicit scenes of brutality that drew comparison to The Godfather and Goodfellas. In the post-Grand Theft Auto 3 climate, Mafia was lumped into the broader public panic over violent video games, especially by US lawmakers and media watchdog groups, who feared the game romanticized criminal behavior. On the PlayStation 2, which had a broader install base that included younger players, concerns were raised about the effectiveness of the ESRB's M for mature rating and whether retailers were doing enough to prevent underage access to the title. Critics also took issue with the game's handling of moral ambiguity, arguing that despite its tragic ending, it still invited players to revel in the power fantasy of organized crime. This tension between cinematic ambition and ethical representation placed Mafia in the crosshairs of both artistic praise and moral scrutiny, making it one of the more controversial narrative-driven titles of its console generation. Marc Ecko's Getting Up, Contents Under Pressure. When Contents Under Pressure launched for the PlayStation 2 in 2006, it was immediately mired in controversy for its bold glorification of graffiti culture and its unapologetic anti-authoritarian messaging. Developed by The Collective and conceived by fashion mogul Marc Ecko, the game follows Train, a young graffiti artist fighting against an oppressive regime in a dystopian city where self-expression is criminalized. While marketed as a work of urban art and social commentary, the game drew significant backlash from law enforcement groups, city officials, and parent organizations who believed it romanticized vandalism and encouraged illegal activity. Politicians in several U.S. cities, including New York and Chicago, spoke out about the game, claiming it would inspire impressionable youth to face public property. In Australia, the game faced even harsher resistance. The country's Classification Review Board outright banned Getting Up, stating that its themes of rebellion and subversion, particularly when linked to real-world graffiti practices, made it unsuitable for release. These reactions sparked broader debates about freedom of expression in video games and whether interactive art could or should depict civil disobedience as a valid form of resistance. In addition to the cultural and political firestorm it ignited, Marc Ecko's Getting Up stirred controversy within the gaming industry itself for blurring the lines between artistic ambition and commercial branding. Critics questioned whether the game was a genuine exploration of urban resistance or a vanity project designed to promote Marc Ecko's fashion empire. The presence of real-world graffiti legends like Cope 2 and Itura 2000, as well as hip-hop artists and street culture icons, gave the game a layer of authenticity, but also opened it up to accusations of commodifying a subculture for mainstream entertainment. Furthermore, the game's narrative, which pitted street artists against a totalitarian regime using graffiti as weapons of political resistance, was seen by some as oversimplistic or heavy-handed in its messaging. While many praised the game for its unique visual style, compelling soundtrack, and ambitious storytelling, others saw it as a glorified advertisement for a brand cloaked in the aesthetics of social justice. Whether viewed as a groundbreaking piece of interactive protest or an opportunistic marketing stunt, Getting Up left a lasting impression by daring to bring real-world controversy into the virtual streets, challenging both societal norms and the boundaries of what video games could represent. The Getaway. The Getaway launched for the PlayStation 2 in 2002, and it immediately drew controversy for its hyper-realistic portrayal of London's criminal underworld. Its graphic violence and the unapologetic use of adult themes, including torture, organized crime, and police corruption. Developed by Sony's London studio, the game aimed to blur the lines between cinema and gameplay, offering a gritty narrative inspired by British gangster films like Snatch and Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. But this cinematic ambition came at a cost. The Getaway was heavily criticized for its excessive use of profanity, blood-soaked shootouts, and morally ambiguous characters. Players controlled Mark Hammond, a former gangster forced back into the criminal world, and later Detective Frank Carter, a police officer whose arc involved brutal violence and systemic corruption. Critics and parent advocacy groups, both in the UK and US, condemned the game for glorifying gangland behavior and for its bleak, mature tones, especially at a time when video game violence was under intense scrutiny following global discussions about media influence on youth behavior. British tabloids and politicians even accused The Getaway of glamorizing criminal lifestyles, prompting renewed calls for stricter age restrictions and content regulations in the video game industry. In addition to its narrative content, The Getaway was also controversial for its attention to realism, most notably in the use of real London streets and landmarks, some of which were digitally recreated with startling accuracy. While this level of detail was a technical achievement, it also raised safety and ethical concerns. Some critics warned that the game could serve as a virtual training ground for criminal activity, particularly due to its carjacking mechanics and urban navigation that mimicked real-world locations. The depiction of the Metropolitan Police using brutal tactics and operating within a flawed justice system further stoked the controversy, with some law enforcement representatives arguing that it painted a dangerously cynical view of public institutions. Additionally, the game's decision to eschew traditional gaming conventions, such as a HUD and map, in favor of cinematic realism led to polarizing reactions from players, some of whom praised the immersion while others criticized it as frustrating and inaccessible. Despite the backlash, the Getaway became a commercial success and laid the groundwork for its sequel, Black Monday, but it remains one of the PlayStation 2's most talked about titles, not just for its technical ambition, but for its role in the ongoing debate about mature themes and social responsibility in video game storytelling. Grand Theft Auto 3. Grand Theft Auto 3 released for the PlayStation 2 in October of 2001, and it didn't just redefine open-world gaming, it also ignited a firestorm of controversy that would follow the franchise for decades. Developed by DMA Design and published by Rockstar Games, GTA 3 introduced players to a sprawling, living city where they could freely commit crimes, interact with a wide range of NPCs, and follow a violent narrative involving gangs, betrayal, and organized crime. The game's open-ended structure allowed players to steal cars, evade police, commit assaults, and engage in gunfights with civilians and law enforcement. While this freedom was revolutionary in gameplay terms, it drew immediate condemnations from politicians, parent groups, and media watchdogs who argued that it glorified criminal behavior and desensitized young players to violence. Critics were especially alarmed by the inclusion of missions involving drug trafficking, prostitution, and cold-blooded murder. U.S. senators like Joe Lieberman and media watchdogs like the Parents Television Council cited GTA 3 as a prime example of why video games needed tighter regulation and enforcement of age ratings. The controversy was so intense that the game became the central focus in the early 2000s moral panic over video game violence. Beyond the game's graphic violence, Grand Theft Auto 3 also drew heavy criticism for its portrayal of women, minorities, and law enforcement. Female characters, particularly sex workers, were often depicted as disposable, with players able to pick up prostitutes to restore health and then kill them for extra cash. A gameplay mechanic that critics called deeply misogynistic and morally irresponsible. Civil rights groups expressed concern over racial stereotyping in character design and dialogue, arguing that the game perpetuated harmful caricatures, especially in its depiction of gang members and immigrant communities. Law enforcement organizations also objected to the game's depiction of police as easily corruptible and brutally violent, reinforcing public distrust in real-world policing institutions. Despite being rated M for mature, GTA 3 was widely accessible to younger players due to lax enforcement of age restrictions at retail outlets, intensifying the backlash. Rockstar's refusal to compromise on its creative vision and its public defense of GTA 3 as satire and social commentary only fueled the media attention further. The controversy didn't just make headlines, it cemented Grand Theft Auto 3 as a cultural flashpoint, a game that challenged not just the boundaries of game design, but the very role of games as a medium for mature and often uncomfortable storytelling. In the end, the PlayStation 2 wasn't just a platform for innovation and record-breaking sales, it was also a battleground for some of the most heated debates in gaming history. From games that pushed the limits of storytelling to those that tested society's tolerance for violence, crime, and political satire, these titles didn't just entertain, they provoked. Whether they were condemned for their graphic content, challenged for their portrayal of sensitive topics, or praised for daring to go where few games had gone before, each of these controversial releases played a role in shaping the cultural perception of video games as a serious, impactful medium. The PS2 era forced players, parents, and critics alike to grapple with difficult questions about censorship, creative freedom, and the evolving boundaries of interactive entertainment. Love them or loathe them, these games left a mark, and they remind us that controversy, for better or worse, is often a sign that a medium is growing up. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the games on this list? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have any suggestions, be sure to leave those down there as well. I'd love to know some of the games that you think are controversial, or either way, I'd love to get a conversation with you in the comments below. If you liked this video, please leave a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. If you'd like to support the channel in a more personal way, consider becoming a member where you can get videos early, or checking out any of the links in the description below. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content, including but not limited to controversial games. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.